Alrighty, we have made it to our last video in these mini-series. This is our arterial blood gas interpretation. Now, this is actually one of my favorites because once you get it, it's really easy and you will definitely use this in other subjects. So let's have a look at them. So you'll see your arterial blood gas table, something like this. Now, I have got our normal ranges for this subject in here, but I am just going to note to you that they do vary in different subjects depending on what you're doing. And they do vary in real life as well, depending on what ward you might be working on or what type of patient population you're working with as to what people will deem a normal or acceptable range for that patient population. So these are the normal ranges in this subject, and you definitely should have these memorized because they don't usually give you the normal ranges in exam questions for ABGs. When you're interpreting these tables, I will always look at the pH first and see whether it's high, low, or normal. So when we have a look at this pH, we can see that it is definitely low, and we know that if a pH is low, that means it's more acidic, and being outside the range tells us that we have an acidosis on our hands. The next thing that I will look for is who's helping and who's hindering. Who's making this problem worse and who's trying to make it better. That's essentially the thought process that I go through in my head, but here's some better wording for you. Our PCO2 is 56. Now that's way above our normal range. Now remember that we said CO2 has acidic characteristics because it dissociates into hydrogen ions in the blood. So when we have higher CO2 levels, we have higher acidity, which is going to reduce our pH. Now let's see if that was helping or hindering this process. Our pH was low, so there's too much acidity. So a high PCO2 increasing acidity when we're already acidotic, that's definitely not helping. So that's going to be who's causing the problem. And so that tells us that we have a respiratory acidosis. Now let's have a look at our next line. So there we have our bicarb, and that's at 32, which is also way above our normal range. Now, bicarb actually helps us mop up hydrogen ions. So we call that more of a basic element. So when we have more bicarb available, that actually reduces acidity, which increases our pH. So in this scenario where our pH is too low, this bicarb is trying to bring that pH back up. That is trying to help us. So we call that a metabolic compensation. And so this bicarb is trying to compensate for the fact that we have all this extra acidity by trying to mop up some of that acidity and bring the pH back up. So it's trying to compensate, and we will call that compensation. Now, because it is coming from the kidneys predominantly, we're just going to label it a metabolic compensation. Because bicarb is mainly managed by our kidneys, we're going to title that a metabolic compensation. The last thing we need to check for is whether this is a partial compensation or a complete compensation. Now, the way that we check for that is, has the compensation been successful or not? Because if it was successful in doing its job, it would have been able to bring the pH back into the normal range, which it has not been able to do. So it's not a full compensation, it's a partial compensation. If this were a fully compensated acidosis, what we would actually see is that that pH level would be just inside the normal range. So that would be 7.35, maybe 7.36, and we would see still that high PCO2 and high bicarb. And that would be a fully metabolically compensated respiratory acidosis, or a respiratory acidosis with full metabolic compensation, because that pH managed to get just back inside that normal range. Because it's not inside the normal range though, we're sticking with partial compensation, and so our label or our classification for this person's acid-base balance is a respiratory acidosis with partial metabolic compensation. Now, if my questions and my reasoning there didn't make too much sense to you, you do have this slide. I think we only showed it to you in the tutorial, but it is coming up in your lectures, so you can get a copy of it here and you can actually follow the flow chart. So if we work our way through that, first we were checking our arterial pH, so that's the pH in our ABG results. And if that pH is below 7.35, this is telling us that that's going to be an acidosis. The next thing that we check, again, who's helping, who's hindering, okay? And we decided that the PCO2 was hindering the process, and that is a respiratory acidosis there. And then the last thing is it compensated, yes or no? We did have compensation. So that was from the kidneys by increasing their bicarb output. And so we had metabolic compensation. And then we just need to say whether it was successful or not, which we know it was not successful, so we have a partial metabolic compensation, and we arrive at the same answer of a respiratory acidosis with partial metabolic compensation. Now, you may need to go through this a couple of times before it lands, but go back through your results or even just change some of the numbers in the table and see where you land with your acid-base disturbances, because once you get this, it's actually really easy, and I know that you can do this.